Wonderful. Seems that our chat function is working. Thanks a lot, Jamie. Okay, I think it's 3:03, 3 minutes past our starting time. We can get started. Dear participants, welcome to NARDAC 2023 April Forum. I'm Clara Liao, NARDAC Chair. The panelists are glad to see many colleagues registered and are looking forward to communicating with you in the Q&A session. Next slide, please, Anna. Thank you. Here's today's agenda. We will have several Q&A sessions today, one after each presentation. If the time permits, we will reserve some time at the end of the forum to collect presentation ideas and topics about RDA you are interested in, or any questions or concerns you may have. You can also use the chat box throughout the forum to input your questions and then thoughts. Your input will help us to prepare future NARDAC forums. Now let's move on to our first topic. Adam Barron, PCC SCT RDA Training Task Group Chair, will bring us the update about RDA training phase 1. Hand it over to you, Adam.
Thank you, Clara. So today I will be presenting on the first phase of the Program for Cooperative Cataloging's training for the official RDA Toolkit. Next slide. The training I will be discussing has been developed by the Standing Committee on Training RDA Training Task Group Monographs. I would like to acknowledge the work of current task group members, Mei Chan, Claire Liao, Robert Maxwell, and Thomas Brendorfer, as well as past members, Laura Ramsey and Amanda Ross. Next slide. The SCT RDA Training Task Group Monographs is charged with developing a training curriculum for PCC participants to catalog print and electronic book monographs using the official RDA Toolkit, LC-PCC application profiles, if available, LC-PCC policy statements, and metadata guidance documentation. While the training may include concepts and examples applicable to a variety of formats, it is expected that other groups within PCC or specialized cataloging communities will develop more in-depth training for cataloging serials and other formats. Next slide. When the task group was charged in July 2020, the LC-PCC policy statements were still being added to the then beta RDA Toolkit, and work on the metadata guidance documentation hadn't even started. As such, the training was always planned to be released in 2 phases. Phase 1, introductory training, was intended to focus on components that did not depend on the policy statements or metadata guidance documents, whereas Phase 2, complete training, would be the complete training for cataloging print and electronic books. While our timeline for releasing the training has continually been pushed back, we have continued with this phased approach. Next slide. Early on in the process, we discussed the audience for our training. As a program for cooperative cataloging task group, our target audience is PCC participants, with our primary audience being everyday catalogers, and our secondary audience being policymakers and specialist catalogers. We also acknowledge that our training will be of interest to many catalogers who are not PCC participants. To help ensure that our training is appropriate for all catalogers, we are assuming a basic level of cataloging training. We wanted to make sure that everyone has the same background without assuming too much prior cataloging knowledge or experience. In this way, we hope that the training can be used by experienced catalogers moving from original RDA to official RDA, as well as catalogers who are new to the profession. Next slide. In addition to defining our audience, we also established a number of learning outcomes. At the end of the introductory training, we expect that people will be able to identify key changes introduced during the 3R project, use and navigate the official RDA toolkit, define key vocabulary terms, and understand new concepts. Next slide. One of our first tasks was to review existing training and presentations for both the original RDA toolkit and what was still the beta RDA toolkit. In reviewing training for original RDA, we hope to identify possible strategies or best practices that we might want to emulate or model in our training, as well as things we might want to avoid. Although not particularly relevant for the introductory training, we thought it was important to organize training based on RDA elements rather than mark fields. As RDA is designed to be implemented in different scenarios, and PCC is slowly moving towards linked data and BibFrame, we thought it was important to focus first on how elements should be recorded according to RDA, and then consider how they should be recorded in MARC. In this way, we feel that we are able to train for today, but plan for the future. Next slide. When it came to reviewing existing training and presentations for the then beta RDA toolkit, our initial goals were to identify possible concepts to include in our introductory training and to recommend existing training or presentations covering those concepts. We reviewed presentations and workshops posted on the RSC and RDA Toolkit websites, as well as videos posted on the RDA Toolkit YouTube channel. For each item, we identified the concepts that were included, decided if we would recommend it or not, and rated it based on how closely it aligned to our introductory training outcomes. In the end, we decided not to create a list of recommended training or presentations. We felt it was more important to create a cohesive training that was logical and systematic in its approach, rather than providing a collection of discrete, disjointed presentations. It also allows us to update the content as the RDA toolkit changes and evolves, rather than being stuck with a static presentation from the past. Fortunately, this work helped us to identify concepts for our introductory training, as well as possible presentations to which we could refer for additional information or ideas for how to present a concept. Next slide. To build on the concepts we already identified by reviewing the existing training and presentations, we also reviewed the guidance chapter in the new RDA toolkit. In reviewing the guidance chapters, it became apparent that some parts were highly relevant to everyday catalogers, while other parts were less important. For the parts that we felt were important, we wanted to make sure that they were included in our training, rather than referring people to the guidance chapter. By including content in our training, we had the flexibility to change how it was presented, as well as including more examples or additional content or explanation. Next slide. After we identified possible concepts to include in our introductory training, we started drafting training slides and shortly afterwards developed a training outline. The training outline organized the training topics into 3 main sections: Introduction to RDA, using the RDA toolkit, and RDA terminology and concepts. Since the guidance chapters, except for Introduction to RDA, are in alphabetical order, we had to consider how we wanted to order the concepts and which ones could possibly be combined together. While the specific content and order has changed as we developed our training slides, these 3 main sections have remained. So let's take a look at what is included in each section. Next slide. So Module 1 is the introduction to the training. And Module 2 is the development of RDA. It provides a brief overview of cataloging standards before RDA and on which RDA is based. It introduces the IFLA Library Reference Model, LRM, and the 3R project to help provide context for catalogers on why we are having to sort of redo RDA training. Module 3 covers the objectives and principles governing RDA. After briefly discussing the general principles from the IFLA Statement on International Cataloging Principles, the module discusses the objectives and principles governing RDA, as well as the user tasks find, identify, select, obtain, and explore. Next slide. Modules 4 through 7 are focused on using the official RDA toolkit. The sections here mirror the sections found in the help section of the toolkit. Module 4 covers how to access the RDA toolkit, including logging in and creating a profile. Module 5 is all about navigating the RDA toolkit. In addition to discussing the various toolbars and tabs, it includes navigation tips and special features, such as how to create a link and determine citation numbers. It provides an overview of the structure of entity and element pages, as well as how to view policy statements. Module 6 begins with the basics of searching in the RDA toolkit before demonstrating how to narrow a search, search by Mark 21 fields or original instruction number, and how to refine and filter search results. Module 7 discusses how to personalize the RDA toolkit by creating views, bookmarks, and notes. Next slide. So the next section, RDA terminology, covers a lot of content. Module 8 introduces the 4 recording methods: unstructured description, structured description, identifier, and IRI. Module 9 presents data provenance, or information about the metadata being recorded. Module 10 provides an overview of RDA entities and elements. It does not discuss specific elements, such as how to record title proper, but rather provides basic information that is applicable to certain categories of elements, such as relationship elements. After summarizing all RDA entities, the following 2 modules are focused on 2 new RDA entities: timespan in Module 11 and nomens in Module 12. Module 12 also covers appellations. The discussion of nomens and appellations leads into Module 13 on coherent and minimum descriptions, which are sort of new concepts in sort of RDA in terms of what is considered core. Modules 14 and 15 are focused on new elements, namely manifestation statements and representative expression. And lastly, we conclude with Module 16 on aggregates and Module 17 on diachronic works. Next slide. So currently, the draft training slides are being reviewed by the Standing Committee on Training. The task group will finalize the slides based on the feedback that we've received and hope to have the training released sometime in mid-June on the Catalogers Learning Workshop. At ALA Annual, the task group will be presenting a joint workshop with NARDAC entitled Unlocking the Power of RDA, where we will present some of the modules in the introductory training. So next slide. So this concludes a very high-level overview of some of the training and the work that we've done so far. If you have questions, we have plenty of time to address them right now.
That's right. Thank you very much, Adam. I'm checking the chat part and then Q&A. I so far haven't seen any questions. It's okay if you don't have any question for now, and we will reserve the time for another general Q&A at the end of our session. Okay, one question pop up. Will the training have exercises?
Yes, some of the training will have exercises included with it. That is especially the training for sort of using and navigating the RDA toolkit. It's one thing to sort of go through and sort of have a demonstration of what it is. I think it's important that there's training and exercises to give people an opportunity to sort of see what they can do on their own. And so, yes, there will be some training, some exercises with the training.
There are another question in the chat part. Will the RSC review the trainings to ensure the interpretation of the official RDA toolkit is accurate?
We have discussed sharing it with the RSC at some point, but right now, I don't know that we have a specific plan. We do have members of RSC on the training task group, and members of NARDAC are also in the group as well. So there's the possibility.
When is the unlocking RDA?
So the workshop,
session? Yeah.
It's the Friday of ALA annual, whatever
Yeah,
date that is. I don't remember.
Yeah, I think Adam answered that. Okay, for the Q&A tool, how did the test information or impact your training plans? So refer to, I think, a PCC test.
Yes. So as just for those who may not know, I'm co-chair of the PCC task group to test the official RDA toolkit. So I can comment a little bit about sort of what we've determined so far from our test of the official RDA toolkit. At this point, so one of the things that has come up through the test is where there are needs for training. And we don't have clear sort of things, but one of the things that has come up is people have indicated that they are concerned about sort of more novice or inexperienced catalogers. Experienced catalogers have struggled with the official RDA toolkit in some ways and are concerned what that looks like for sort of those who are less experienced catalogers. And so by approaching our training in a way that assumes a basic level of understanding, we're hoping that that can address some of the concern in terms of getting people more involved or understanding of the official toolkit without trying to overwhelm them too much. But there's huge training needs in terms of using and navigating the toolkit, but also understanding some of the concepts that are presented.
There are a couple of questions related to whether the trainings will be free. I said that the unlocking power of RDA workshop isn't free, but the training slides will be posted for free at LC website.
Yes, that's correct.
In the chat box again, will there be examples of types of information system that will be employed? Are there plans to reach out to cataloging educators specifically?
So the examples that we're looking at, so one of the things is, I think there's different types of examples, but what we're really looking, or what I think we'll eventually end up with is sort of instructions or in terms of training, in terms of how something should be recorded in RDA when we're talking about the more general training. And then what it looks like in terms of an example of this is how you record it in MARC. So if we're looking at title proper, for example, we'll go through how you determine the title proper, and then it will show the title proper coded in 245. We have included examples of metadata description sets and sort of other things which are more kind of basics, but it's not really sort of demonstrating what may look like in terms of linked data, but it's really just a way of presenting the information differently, and it doesn't focus so much on the systems that are used. For example, like there's not going to be examples of what something looks like in Sinopia or Marva, which is the LC bibframe editor. I don't see that at this point being something it's in our training. It's certainly not something that is in our introductory training. but we do cover sort of metadata description sets and sort of what that looks like in a more general sense. In terms of plans to reach out to cataloging educators specifically, at this point, that's not something that we've necessarily considered. Our target audience is PCC participants, and so we are focusing on terms of what we know from PCC participants is people working in a sort of PCC institutions and doing cataloging training for colleagues and our others. So we haven't reached out to cataloging educators specifically.
Okay, I think if there are more questions, we will answer them. Adam will answer them at the end of the whole presentations. I think we can move on to the next topic. Our second topic is very challenging and interesting one, brought by our old friend, Dr. Ahava Cohen. Last year, Dr. Cohen brought us EURIG's update, information about the policy work of RDA regional group in Europe. We are very grateful that she accepted the NARDAC's invitation again to talk about her research about gendered language in non-English sources. I think it's late evening time in your time zone, Doctor. We're looking forward to learning from you. Hand it over to you.
Thank you. Honor, can you go to the first slide? I want to start off by saying that this presentation was very difficult to write, and a lot of people warned me not to give this presentation because of fear of being misunderstood and because gender is a delicate subject in the United States. So if I say something which offends someone or hurts them, please be in touch so that we can discuss it. I assure you it is not intentional. For the most part, I'm not talking about gender in ways which align with how English functions. And that's really the main point of what I'm saying, is that gendered language in many languages is something very different than what it is in English. In 2022, the US Census Bureau released the results of a 2019 study estimating that only 20% of Americans can converse in a second language, while Statistics Canada reported in that same year that 41.2% of Canadians can conduct a conversation in more than one language. So some of what I'm going to say may be new to a significant number of people on this call, and that's what I'm aiming at. Next slide. My journey with gender issues and cataloging began in 2014 when I began writing my doctoral dissertation on the implementation of RDA in Israeli academic libraries. Though I was born in the US, I have lived the majority of my life in Israel in Hebrew-speaking environments. I'm the graduate of 2 different Hebrew language LIS programs, and I've taught cataloging in 3. My first cataloging job was working with materials in multiple languages. My second was as head of Hebrew cataloging department at the National Library of Israel, and I'm currently the head of the entire cataloging section, which includes Hebrew, Arabic, and foreign language, including Russian cataloging departments. In Israel, we catalog in 4 languages: Hebrew for all resources using the Hebrew script, Arabic for all languages written in Arabic script, Russian for all languages using Cyrillic script, and English for everything else. The first 3 languages are considered highly gendered, while English is not. But English is still used to catalog gendered languages that are foreign languages from Israeli point of view, like German, Spanish, Italian, Greek, Marathi, and so on and so on. So for the almost decade I've been a librarian, gender and cataloging has been a significant part of my work and of my research. While I'll focus on gender in Hebraica cataloging tonight, because that's my day-to-day language, what I say is applicable to many other highly gendered languages, particularly those not written in the Latin character set. I won't go into how highly gendered languages got that way. If that interests anyone in the context of Hebrew, I suggest you look up Rotem Yitzhaki's doctoral thesis written at the City University of New York, which is available online and contains some very interesting ideas. I also apologize in advance to the Francophone colleagues on the call, as I'll be focusing more on the Anglo-American community and particularly the ALA, Library of Congress, PCC community. Next slide, please. To get us all on the same page, let's start with some terminology. Papadopoulos splits languages into one of 4 types when it comes to gender. Morphological gender, also called grammatical gender, are systems of nominal classification in which all nouns in a given language are assigned to one of 2 or more classes, which are called genders, based on social gender or other semantic, meaning-based, or form-based criteria. Canonical definitions of morphological gender enumerate 3 criteria for its identification: variable assignment of all nouns in a given language to one or of 2 or more nominal classes, reflected in patterns of agreement on dependent elements of the noun, and third, usually assigned based on formal criteria. Pronomial gender, which Papadopoulos also calls pronoun culture, is the primary use of gender in the language is through pronouns, particularly third-person pronouns of entities which have biological sex differences. These are also called natural gender languages. Morphologically gendered languages also have pronouns, but they include second person. While in English, you can talk to a person without risking misgendering them, in a morphologically gendered language, you can't. I tried it today. Within 3 words in a conversation with someone, I had gendered myself and the other person. The third type is lexical gender, which are things like noun pairs like uncle, aunt, which don't have umbrella terms that are gender neutral. And that can be a feature of any language. But as with terms like nibbling, it's something that evolves and changes in languages which aren't morphologically gendered. The pairs also can appear in languages which are considered genderless, like Turkish and Finnish, in which nouns and pronouns aren't typically gender marked. And the fourth is radical gender, in which semantic and phonetical radicals mark gender in languages like Chinese. Next slide, please. How does morphologically gendered language affect catalogers? The Hebraica Judaica catalog community is basically split in 2. Those who follow Israeli policy and catalog in the vernacular, and those who follow LCPCC policy and catalog in their local languages. And for North America, generally that's English. The US community, led by the cataloging committee of the Association of Jewish Libraries, the AJL, catalogs in English, so Romanization of Hebrew is their big issue, while Israel doesn't have to worry about transliteration. So our big issues are Mark Authority Field 375 and the gender of what was known as in the OG Toolkit as relationship designators. Next slide. In 2014, the Inter-University Cataloging Committee in Israel, which sets policy for Israeli university libraries and by trickle down for all others, decided that all relationship designators would be recorded in the masculine, so-called generic form. When the Academy of the Hebrew Language, a governmental organization tasked with directing the course of development of Hebrew, was appealed to by college libraries and by language teachers, they ruled that the masculine is the unmarked generic form, but only when discussing people in general, not specific individuals. Despite this, the Inter-University Cataloging Committee, led by foreign language cataloging managers heavily influenced by US practice, ruled that saving the time of the cataloger by having a default gender was more important than displaying terms matching the grammatical gender preferred by the bibliographic entity, and in any case, to quote one of the cataloging managers, Meryl Streep in RDA is an actor, not an actress. So that's a sign that RDA doesn't want us to use gendered language. Next slide, please. And that's why you won't find a single female cis or trans or non-binary person in Israeli university catalogs. Men include cis men, trans men, and all other humans, corporate bodies, families, and non-human personages, men, including women. So there's no mechaberet, female author, just mechabel, male author. No ma'ayelet, female illustrator, just ma'ayel, male illustrator. Next slide. The easiest compromise between the Academy's language-based ruling, honoring the preference of the bibliographic entities represented in library catalogs, and the desire to save the time of the cataloger is through the authority file, for Israeli cataloging at least. Using Mark 375 to record the grammatical gender of entities based on the language present in their publication and on directly asking them, and then cross-referencing that information with the relationship designators in bibliographic records, the back office can continue to use a single gender term, while the front-end public catalog can display the appropriate grammatical term. The form pictured here on the screen is what NLI sends to people for whom we need more authority information. Aside from one question about religious tribal affiliation, which is only recorded for people who identify both as male and as Jewish, all the other questions are phrased to include both grammatical genders. The question whose answer is recorded in Mark Authority 375 here asks specifically about grammatical gender, and it's open-ended. To date, although we've had people choose not to fill in that information, we have not had a single person who's chosen anything other than one of the two grammatical genders. In talking with people belonging to communities which might be interested in other solutions, we've been told that even though in their social life, they may use a grammatical gender not aligned with their gender identity, or may use a mix and match of the grammatical genders, given the formal context of a library catalog, they prefer to conform to the rules of the language. In addition, several trans authors, both in our catalog and in research that's been conducted in different fields in Israel, have stated that they found that using the grammatical gender matching their identity is very gender affirming, particularly if that doesn't align with the gender assigned at birth. Next slide, please. Does the Israeli treatment of Mark 375 break the format? It's not clear. The field definition and scope doesn't define what it means by gender, and based on that part of the page, the reference to grammatical gender could be in line with the specifications. The subfields add in the specificity to gender identification. It's that mismatch which creates problems for dealing with bibliographic entities working in morphologically gendered languages. Next slide. Does everyone agree to follow the rules of the language as set out by the Academy of the Hebrew Language, even if just in formal contexts? The literature shows very different experiences lived by those who live in the language. See, for example, the research of Orit Berstlig and the experiences lived by language learners who come from languages with a different level of gender. See, for example, the research of Gillan and Barros. There are few projects to create neopronouns and new ways of formulating Hebrew words to be gender neutral, but those are generally centered outside of Israel and are aimed at communities which don't live their everyday lives in the Hebrew language. Many of these projects rely strongly on nikud, which here are the shapes that you see above and below the letter forms in Hebrew. And those shapes represent Hebrew vowels and are generally not used in writing Hebrew aside from in children's materials and in poetry. We live our lives in consonant. New words created with non-standard vowels shouldn't be confused with the use of matras lectiones, which are consonants that are used to indicate a vowel. Here you see the use of there's yuds and heys, and sometimes you'll see a suf also, which can signify particularly the female grammatical form. These new ungrammatical words aren't a problem for Israeli catalogers because we transcribe title and other transcribed information letter for letter without the vowels. They're a significant problem for Anglo-American catalogers who transliterate both transcribed and recorded elements based on reference sources and on vocalization. Thus, for many words and names, gender has to be determined before cataloging can be done. Words which don't follow standard Hebrew grammar are much more challenging to transliterate. Before I get too far into issues of romanization, I just want to take a moment to thank Jasmine Shinohara of the University of Pennsylvania, who's on this call, who was very patient and answered a lot of my questions about the romanization practice of US Hebraica catalogers. Next slide, please. Other consonants can also hint at gender, such as the tuf at the end of the word ratzit or ratzita. I can't even say it without gendering it, which translates in English to you wanted. In the picture of the album cover, it's the words that are in red, the second word of the words that are in red. If it's pronounced ratzita, it means you male wanted, and if it's ratzit, it's you female. The unvocalized word can be read either way. The cataloger who created the record for this song had to choose one version for the 245, making that the authorized reading of the word. The Hebrew title doesn't provide information as it's got no vowels. The standard procedure is to try to determine the gender which the word represents and use that in the 245. If it's unclear which gender the word represents, one is chosen for the 245 and the other is recorded in the 246. In this record, the cataloger chose ratzita, the male form, for the 245, and ratzit, the female form, as a variant, a 246. However, the chorus of the song is Rak ratzit ahava, va'at besimlat prachim chikit, vehu od lo hufia, rak ratzit ledaber, kivit sheyesh makom la'ahava. You heard, I said ratzit, you female. The form chosen for the 245 isn't the form sung in the song, and that distorts the meaning of the lyrics and misgenders the entity to whom the song is sung. Next slide, please. Another example of the complexities of gender and romanization is this vendor record. Poetry, as I said earlier, is generally written with the vowels in Hebrew, but Israeli cataloging transcribes just the letters without the vowels, while Anglo-American cataloging takes the vowels into account in the process of romanization. This record is for a book of poetry written by a father to and about his child. The poems were written before and after the author's child came out as a trans man. The title would translate to English as I Am Your Father. But since Hebrew is a morphologically gendered language, the last word, the pronoun your, isn't vocalized, has no nikud, and can be read as shelcha, spoken to a male, or shelach, spoken to a female. Despite poetry being vocalized in this book, the pronoun on the title page is not, allowing it to be read either way. The romanizing cataloger has to take this word, which is left intentionally vague by the author, and add gender to it, turning the author's journey of coming to terms with his child's identity, the whole point of the book, into a single point of acceptance in the 245 and retraction in the 246. Next slide, please. While in Israel, the use of neopronouns and non-standard vocalization is not common, what is becoming more and more common is the use of typography, which can be read as either grammatically male or grammatically female. A common sight is the use of periods or slashes to add on to the grammatically male form the letters which would make the word grammatically female. The Academy of the Hebrew Language has officially ruled that this usage is diametrically opposed to the rules of the Hebrew language, and that using periods and slashes in the middle of words is not allowed by the language and leads to reading the text as words which don't exist. An attempt to get around the ruling of the Academy is using a font developed by Michal Schumer, a design graduate from the Holon Institute of Technology. The font is freely downloadable and adds 12 new characters to the Hebrew alphabet. The last two characters on the title screen, the two most leftward characters on the line below the larger drawing, are new characters, informing us that we can add on the feminizing hey or leave it out. This title creates issues both for Israeli and Anglo-American catalogers. The new characters don't appear on a standard keyboard, and so can't be transcribed into Hebrew language bibliographic records. Because the second word of the title is designed to be read in two separate ways, it presents the same challenge to Anglo-American catalogers as does the title we saw earlier, even though the presence of vowels might make a novice think that it would be easier to transliterate. Excuse me. In some ways, this title is more challenging because it's the context that made the earlier title readable in two different ways, while in this resource, the font requires us to read the title in two different ways simultaneously. The Israeli solution was to contact the publisher and work together to come up with a reading which could be keyed into the bibliographic record, but which respected the intentions of the authors and the publisher. It's not a sustainable solution in the long run, especially not for Anglo-American catalogers who need to communicate in a language which is not necessarily their most comfortable across time zones and cultural differences. Next slide, please. The National Library of Israel catalogs approximately 23,000 Hebrew script titles a year, excluding archives, manuscripts, music, and maps. In order to make our records more widely accessible and helpful to Anglo-American libraries, we've been working with academia for the past several years to help computers learn how to do romanization. It's an incredibly difficult process because of the complexities of romanization and because the short form of a title gives very little context for automatic decision-making. Given the large number of titles cataloged each year, and the fact that Israeli catalogers have no practical need for romanization skills, if the machine can't be taught to reach a level of accuracy acceptable to Anglo-American, Hebraica, and Judaica catalogers, the project will have no advantage over the current time-consuming work of the Anglo-American catalogers. On the screen, you see a few attempts to get the program to correctly vocalize words which could be read as either of the two grammatical genders. If the words were correctly vocalized, the machine could then romanize based on ALA-LC romanization tables. However, the machine vocalized the words which would translate as your uterus as halechem shelcha, your male uterus. When asked to vocalize the title, which would translate as I, female, love you, a lesbian novel, the machine offered Ani ohevet otcha, I, female, love you, male, which in the context of a lesbian novel is probably not the right vocalization. When given I, male, love you, the machine returned Ani ohev otcha, I, male, love you, male. No females are invited or required. Though vocalizations can be corrected by hand, the errors mean that the machine can't yet be relied on to vocalize and romanize at scale. Next slide, please. The gender of persons also affects romanization. The letters Mem, Yud, Chaf, Lamed can be read as Michal, typically a woman's name. In the Bible, she was the daughter of King Saul. Or Michal, a name usually used by men often but not exclusively in conjunction with the name Yechiel. They have different romanizations, and to determine which romanization to use, the gender of the name has to be determined. The same thing can happen with other word pairs, as seen in this authority record, which had originally romanized the letters Taf Mem Resh on the title page verso as Tomel, typically a man's name. The publisher, when contacted, confirmed that the illustrator is a woman named Tamal. While the 100 reflects the correct name, and one of the 400 shows that the record was corrected, it's only the 670, which I did not show on this slide, which contextualizes the correction as being the cataloger's error in misreading the name and misgendering the name, and not a change in the gender identification and name of the illustrator. Next slide, please. And here's where I might be getting a little controversial. What if the Anglo-American community finished the work started in the LCPCC recommendations about gender and authority records and eliminated any hints about gender in 3XX fields and in 6XX fields? What if that work were then extended to gender information in bibliographic records? In the case of Hebrew, that might mean changing authority 100s. What do we do with all the bens and bars in Arabic? What do we do with the ibns and and bints? That's all gender information. In the bibliographic record, it might mean not transcribing all of the statements of responsibility because of the gendered information they possess. Katav, Siper, Iel all tell me that the people who are doing those actions use grammatically male terminology, while Katva, Sipra, Ira tells me that that person uses female grammatical terminology. 520s would have to be carefully constructed to avoid gendered language. How do we draw the line between pronomial gender and grammatical gender? And then how do we also keep in line with RDA guidelines about transcription versus recording if we need to cut out essential information in the original? RDA's come up with a partial solution to the problem with the introduction of community resources, which allow each community to not only tell its own members what the local guidelines are, but can also help catalogers overseas dealing with the specificity of a specific language materials, can help them figure out how to work with that in their own context. That being said, to say that the PCC LC guidelines only affect the Anglo-American community is disingenuous. In the 40s, 50s, 60s of the 20th century, American cataloging spread across the world, partially as part of US aid packages, and that legacy is going to have to be faced while creating policy for the US and NARDAC communities. Next slide, please. Look again at the map for a minute. There are about 400 languages represented in OCLC, which is the meeting place of Anglo-American cataloging and the rest of the world. This map represents grammatical gender in 256 languages, with white meaning that there's no grammatical gender, yellow means there are 2 grammatical genders, orange 3 genders, red 4 genders, and black 5 or more genders. Where's their preponderance of white circles, and where's their color, and where's the black? What does insisting on an English language understanding of gender say to catalogers in this area, primarily the Global South? Usually I end a talk with a rousing call to action, but there's really no good answers here. English is the de facto language of international cataloging. The RDA Toolkit's base expression is English. The RSC and the RDA board conduct their business in English. But the Anglo-American community is also that, a community with its own language and its own needs. And somehow the 2 faces of the community will have to be considered in tandem going forward to both safeguard members of the community from politics and from harm, but without causing harm to other communities whose policies are affected by policy decisions within the Anglo-American community. How can this be done? I'm not the person to tell you. I'm not part of your community. EURIG has been raising the issue of morphological versus pronomial gender in RDA for several years now, and will continue to do so, but we're also willing, able, and interested in working with Anglo-American catalogers to find mutually beneficial solutions. There have been too many cataloging discussions in recent years which have said they were international in scope, but actively required that all discussion and all reading material be in English. I invite you to invite the rest of the world in, not only for our sakes, but also for the sakes of your own catalogers who work on material in the other 399 OCLC languages. Last slide, please. Thank you for listening and for your consideration. I hope that you take what I've said in the spirit in which it was intended, especially given the late hour here in Israel and my speaking in a language which tends to leave me as the night progresses. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them here, later on in the update session, or even later by email or by WhatsApp. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Doctor. We do have a question. Is the ruling of the Hebrew Language Academy binding in library catalogs?
Technically not, because we're not technically governmental agencies, but it's understood that as a part of the academic community, libraries will try to use correct grammar. And it's very jarring when libraries don't use correct grammar.
Thank you so much. We do have lots of applause in the chat part of people amazed by your presentation. Thank you so much for being with us. Okay, if you have more questions for the doctor, please put them in the chat box or contact Dr. Cohen after the presentation. Let's move on to our third topic today. Next slide, Anna. Yay. Anna Moody has worked as RDA Toolkit example editor since May 2019. Even though many users have concerns about the official RDA's language, terms, content structure, no one can deny it is very helpful to have examples in the RDA Toolkit. Today, let's learn more about examples in the RDA Toolkit. Hand it over to you, Anna.
Hi, everyone. So I've been running the slideshow for everyone else. I have to do it while I speak. So let's see if I can rub my tummy and pat my head at the same time. Maybe, maybe not. Very quickly, I'm going to give you an overview, understanding RDA Toolkit examples. So we'll look at the different kinds of examples. I'll talk a little bit about the process of developing new examples. And then I'll talk very briefly at the end about some future work and some examples that you won't see currently and may not for a while, and why. So understanding RDA Toolkit examples, I'm going to cover the principles underlying RDA Toolkit examples, and then I will review the 4 kinds of examples that you're going to see in the toolkit. And the principles are really that examples illustrate elements as appropriate for the language version of RDA in which they appear. So I am working in, as Ahava pointed out, base RDA in English, and we do use the ALA LC romanization tables when transcribed data that is specifying romanization is used. If I were ever to use a non-ALA romanization scheme, I would indicate that in the example, but for generally romanized data will be in an ALA LC romanization form. The data are correct in the context of the instruction and may not necessarily reflect the forms found in databases of agents using RDA. So that accounts both for different options being selected, as well as the potential for existing databases to have older non-RDA data in them. So that's just something to be aware of. In original RDA Toolkit, there was a public examples guide that included additional principles that have been carried over into now unpublished examples, editorial guide for examples, And some of those principles include that the examples are illustrative and not prescriptive. So that is, they do not, cannot be used in place of an instruction. They illustrate an instruction. They illustrate the instruction at which they appear. They are unambiguous, and they require either no explanation or very little explanation. And there are a few more there, but the sort of, you get the general idea. I don't want to overly bore you all before I get to the good stuff. And then, so using those principles, then there are 4 kinds of examples. There's basic examples, which illustrate an element using an applicable recording method, and they may contain an explanatory note. The recording method examples, which show multiple recording methods, so that's unstructured, structured, identifier, and IRI. View as relation examples, which provide a linked data visualization of an element using RDA registry labels and IRIs from various sources. And then view in context examples, which contain a set of elements that are repeated throughout RDA to demonstrate how elements identify an entity. And when a view in context example appears on an element page, it will be in bold, and I'll show you an example of that, if you will. So first of all, I just wanted to let you know that the default is that examples, the example boxes are collapsed and you have to click on them to expand them, but you can actually change that setting in the views tab. It's views, manage views. So here's one for myself. I have multiple actually. So this one is called no PS because I don't have any policy statements selected. And you can see that here. And I typically leave all of the examples collapsed. They can take up quite a bit of room. And also because as a cataloger, I'm not going to use every option. There are specific ones that I'm going to use. So I don't necessarily even need to see all the possible examples when I'm routinely doing my work. And I'll just point out, since I've got this up on the screen, that you can also choose whether or not to always open the element reference. And I do not have that clicked. I do not need to see it all. I see in the chat that there's some sound issues. Is everyone having problems with my sound? Okay. So here then is the a single example with a basic note. So I have a condition and a condition option box. And here the example box, which I've shown expanded here because obviously it would not be helpful for me to show you a collapsed example box. Is embedded in the condition option box, and it appears in this light blue text. And I have then within the example box, I have the actual example that is illustrating the condition option, record the value that appears first. And then I have the recording method. There are some older examples which do not specify the recording method. I have started to do this routinely for all examples, even if only one recording method is acceptable within the example. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, I do think the specificity of the recording method is new, so I think it has an educational value. But it is also true that some of the element pages can get quite long, and you can potentially forget whether or not you're in an unstructured description or a structured description section. And so this is an easy way, it's right there in the example, to remind you that that's what's going on. And finally, this one does have an explanatory note. The explanatory note here is needed to make sense of the choice and to illustrate that I have in fact complied with the condition option. But I do want to point out one stylistic thing here. See how it says note in bold and the background is blue? We're going to see a different flavor of this later in the presentation. The back end in the content management system is called DITA, Darwin Information Type Architecture. It's an XML flavor. And as with all XML, the style and the display is based on sort of choices that you make, and that's done programmatically. And sometimes it's the choices you make, it's hard to tell what they are going to appear, particularly for, say, me, where I'm a little bit removed from that style sheet development. So this is, so I just wanted to point that out too, because we will look at it later. And now I have, this is an example, still a basic example, but this one has multiple examples for the same condition option. And here, record a value for corporate body. And so I have the example box here expanded again. And then I have the first example. And here, this is a structured description. You can see this is a case where I'm in a general condition, so I can use one or more recording methods. So the example also shows that you can use the multiple recording methods. But here, because I have specified a structured description, I also specified the vocabulary encoding scheme source. So in this case, Library and Archives Canada. And that is because a structured description is really only meaningful if you know the vocabulary encoding scheme that it comes from. And here I actually was doing this presentation, I realized that the example, this is transferred from the original toolkit, where the indicator that this meets the condition is actually present in the subtitle, and I have only recorded the preferred title. So I actually am going to go back in and add the subtitle information, which makes it clear that they're talking about the party platform, and thus meeting the condition. And then in the second example here, again, so this is, I have two values of corporate body recorded, and this is again because a value in official RDA is actually one or more values. Typically, if there's only a single value allowed, it's further specified. So when you see, this is covered in terminology section of resources, so of the guidance chapter. So, but here I have the American National Standards Institute is one corporate body, and then National Information Standards Organization is the second. And you can see in these notes, the last note we saw, it just said note, whereas here I have a more specific note. It's the title of work. You'll also see source of information or a few others. And I am trying to standardize those because those are embedded in the output class, and that's which I will explain later. But basically, that's going to give me that bold pre-colon data in, and that's actually true for both the recording method VES source and the title of work in all of these examples. So recording method examples then are examples that show the multiple recording methods applied to the same instance of an element. And so you'll see it most often when all four recording methods are applicable and the options are straightforward and limited in number. And that's because if you have a lot of options associated with an element, it can be hard to tell the difference between a recording method example and a basic example because they do tend to look pretty similar. So also because they're each recording method example is associated with the option at that recording method, it's not really possible to get a screenshot that's readable for all of you. So here I have just extracted the example information, but if you go to expression, language of expression, the examples then are given for recording methods with Chinese, the language of the expression has a language of expression, Chinese, and unstructured description, Chinese language, which is the structured description from the vocabulary encoding scheme, the Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus. And then here I have the identifier and then the IRI. And then the VES will also be specified for an identifier, but not for the IRI because the IRI self-declares and I do not need to specify it in the machine readable context. But they do not, in the recording method examples, they all have to describe that same instance, but they don't actually have to come from the same vocabulary encoding scheme. So for the structured or the IRI, for structured identifier or IRI. So here I have play, the unstructured description, which is the category of work, drama, a structured description from the Library of Congress genre form terms, a Q number from Wikidata, and then the IRI from Wikidata. And here then we now have the view as relationship examples. So again, these are a sort of linked data representation, but you'll see there is actually a natural language. Well, how natural language can a structured access point be, but we have a authorized access point for this expression that is equivalent to the VF IRI. So that's the first part of it. So this expression then has language of expression. And here we have the verbalized RDA element name that is equivalent to the RDA registry IRI. And then finally, we have the instance value, which is English. In this case, it happens to be already included in the authorized access point for expression. But then you see here we have the vocabulary from the id.look.gov list of languages. So you see the a written format at the top, and then you see the machine readable format, because of course we are not machines and we can't read a VF IRI and know what that means. So the view as relationship example, much like the view in context, which I'll go over next, are not associated, they're associated with the element and not with a particular option. So these are at the bottom of the page. View as relationship will appear first, followed by view in context if both is present. So then the view in context examples, again, are a set of elements that are repeated throughout RDA, and they demonstrate how elements identify an entity. So here you have corporate body, and then you have a list of elements, and then in the right column is an element, the element values. This particular example was taken from the element page for successor of corporate body, and that is why it is highlighted in blue. The element page that it is on will appear in blue. If it were on has related corporate body of corporate body, this would be in blue. And there is a bug. I just want to let you know, I can't remember what it is, but one of the instance values appears in bold also, but it is not in blue. And that is a display issue, but it's a low priority display issue. So I don't know when it will be addressed. And so I know I said there were 4 examples, but there's a secret 5th example, and it's new, and it's a latent example. So it's defined as data illustrating RDA text, but that is not itself an instruction. So in original toolkit, this would usually be, e.g. or for example, and then followed by something. So I'm working with the RDA secretary to update these when we find them. So you will still see those latent examples. So here we see 11.2.2.10 has terms indicating incorporation and other certain terms. And there were, we see these 3 options, and 2 of them had that, for example. So now we see an example box in the condition box itself that illustrates the text, but is not part of it. And I do want to point out something here that I'll talk about in transferring examples, which is that oftentimes what we see in original toolkit, you would have like 3 subparagraphs. Each of those paragraphs is now a separate condition, and so then might have related options. So whereas in the original toolkit, you might see a long block of examples, often you're much less likely to see that kind of long block, one for stylistic reasons, which I'll talk about, but also just because often that's really, in the original toolkit, all of those examples are really exemplifying different instructions that have then been teased apart. So developing new examples. So basically there's 2 kinds here. There's moving examples for equivalent original RDA toolkit instructions, and then there's creating totally new examples. So this would both be for instructions that never had examples in the original toolkit, as well as for the elements not found in original toolkit. So nomen, time span, and the like. And so the general process is, for transferring them is to identify corresponding instructions, assess them to make sure they're still valid, adjust and replace. And then some will be changed to increase the diversity of resources and resource creators, and also for currency. And then I reformat them, and then I embed them. So I'm just going to give you some quick screenshots of what that looks like. So here we have manifestation, title of manifestation, which is roughly equivalent to 2.3.1. You can see there's a whole bunch here. Some of these are actually now in the normalized transcription guidance also, and they appear in other places. But we're looking here at the hierarchy in organizations. So then this is what the back end is, and this is the note ID. I do not have a, you see here I have the output, other type output, so that's going to result in that recording method. And for note, it looks like there's one here, and it's not going to appear in the real toolkit. So anyway, I create these. So this is a single file, which will have all of the examples for all of the conditions and options in the basic examples in the title of manifestation. And then parts of that then get embedded at specific places within the element file in the back end. And this means that I can change or update an example without having to edit the element file once it's been associated with that element file. And so then this is how that example appears in the official RDA toolkit. And you can see that here we have this weird gray box and it doesn't tell you that it's a note. And that's because of that back-end coding. And that is why I'm in the process of updating these as I change them for other reasons. So very quickly, some additional currency. Many examples in the original toolkit were carried over from ACR2, and some of them are really dated. There's a lot about Cold War things that are probably of minimal interest to the current cataloger. East German state-owned corporate bodies, not something most people are likely to come across in their day-to-day work. Also representation. Do the resources used in examples represent the full diversity of cultural heritage resource creators? And are the examples culturally appropriate, right? I can apply a structured, I could use an example, but if I'm going to use a vocabulary encoding scheme that does not have a culturally appropriate term or even has an offensive term, then I'm not really doing much good there. And then finally, the examples can be made up, but I prefer to use real examples whenever possible. One, cataloging standards are a posteriori constructs, and two, the richness of the bibliographic universe is a wonder to behold. It's one of the things I like best about being a cataloger, is that they're weird and wild and wonderful. So why would I make something up when there's probably somebody out there has already done it that way? And so then just quickly for creating new examples, I just troll WorldCat, Hollis, usually do the back end because the searching is better. Early on in the pandemic, I would use HathiTrust when we had that limited access. Now I'm more likely to use something that's in the office that I come across or records I come across during the course of my day job. I am a manager, so I don't do a ton of cataloging, but I do a surprising amount of database maintenance. So that's just sort of how I come across things. It's a little haphazard, probably searching WorldCat or Hollis are the two sort of broad net ones. And so for future work, there's creation of new examples using Google Forms, which I will talk about a little bit more, but then updated examples for authorized access points. So there was originally, there were originally examples for authorized access points, but they were removed with the string encoding scheme process. And so I will add them back in, or the plan is to add them back in, but I'm waiting for communities to develop specific string encoding schemes that I can reference when I use those examples so that you know exactly how the elements are being brought together. And there's one other area that I haven't mentioned here, which is that the extent, I have intentionally not added any examples for extent because I knew that the RSC was in the process of charging the extent working group, which they have, which is part of their charge is really to implement the aspect unit quantity model, which has been talked about throughout the history of RDA. There were, prior art from 2012, 2013, 2015, 2016. So it's this long-standing issue that they've always known about, but I didn't see a value in adding a lot of examples for extent when I knew that there were likely to be a lot of proposals to adapt that model so that it's more machine actionable. Now, the Google form idea here is that there would be, basically this, I can use a Google form to feed into a spreadsheet that I could then develop a script for to convert that into data. thus removing my ham-handed human coding errors, and ultimately, if I can get that, or the next RDA Examples Editor can get the editorial guide published, then RDA users could use the form to essentially submit fully formed examples without having to know the back-end processes. So basically that saves us from using the CMS, which has some limited access, and there's reasons why we don't want to hand that out to just anyone. So 2 things the RSC wants to do. 1, if you have familiarity with converting spreadsheet data to XML, I'd love to hear from you. I have the idea that implementation is harder. But the other thing to note is the RSC will be recruiting a new RDA Examples Editor later this year. My term is ending. The new term will begin in January 2024, and there'll be a 4 to 6 month training period to get you up to speed. So the responsibilities are there, but basically, if you have knowledge of RDA content and basic familiarity with the official RDA toolkit, very few communities are using the official RDA in cataloging practice. So the expectation is not that you have been cataloging with the official RDA toolkit. And really what you need to know is the original RDA content, because once you start working with the toolkit, you'll get up to speed quickly, right? It'll be hard at first, but you'll get there. Now that might look different for the next call, but right now that's, I think, likely to stand. So knowledge of practical interpretation, comfort with multiple formats, like all of these are things. So also I will say, if you have experience with XML and XML editors, the more experience you have with it, the less likely you're going to be doing it manually. And then finally, fluency in English and bibliographic knowledge of some other languages, ideally including a non-Latin script language, and good communication skills. So I hope that some of you will consider applying to be the RDA Examples Editor once that call goes out. So in general, if you have questions or suggestions for specific examples, you can always use the submit feedback link from within the RDA toolkit, or you can email me, the Examples Editor, at honor@rdatoolkit.org. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. We do have a few questions for you. One is like, seems the original RDA definitely contained more examples than the official RDA. Absence of examples in large parts of the official RDA toolkit runs risk of elements not being used or misused. Is there any possibility that the RSC or LCPCC consider walking the example from the MGD into RDA toolkit as a means of filling gaps?
So I think I tried to demonstrate just why it's so difficult to move those examples and why it's not just a cut and paste process. And I will also say that, I would have liked there to be more examples, but there was this like global pandemic situation. And then I lost like a third of my direct reports. So let's just say that there are probably limits. So I do think that a collaborative approach is good, which is why I like that Google form. My concern with the LCPCC, coordinating with the LCPCC in particular, is that that is a single community, and the RDA examples really need to represent the full scope of examples in RDA and the multiplicity of communities that are using it. And I think we're already actually, because those examples are coming out of AACR2 and even the original toolkit, so many of them were just carried over, that we're already overrepresented for those cataloging communities to the detriment of the non-Anglo-American cataloging communities. That said, and I think there are a lot of those elements, those examples are going to display specific policy choices, which might not be appropriate for RDA. And I guess that gets back to what I was talking about the examples are accurate, but they may not be reflective of what agents use in their databases. But yes, I think we can all agree that I would love to see more examples. I will also say that in the original RDA, a lot of those examples were pretty duplicative, and there's not as much, and I want to move away from that because I think we're already scrolling a lot on these screens, and I think there's kind of a limit to the value that they add at a certain point.
Thank you, Anna. Another question, have you found any cataloging situations for which you are unable to find an existing example?
I have not so far, but that doesn't mean that it is impossible. I suspect it is impossible. Again, I mean, right, we catalog based on our experience. Sometimes we like to pretend that it's theory, but it's really, we're doing this based on the resources that have been published. We are a responsive field because we don't catalog imaginary things. We catalog, especially in RDA, or official RDA, we catalog real things. So that's that part of that.
Great. One final question for you. Are you the only person encoding all the examples? Is there a team that manages the example?
Yep, just me. Again, you know, that's why I want to get that Google form. I have high hopes for that Google form so that I can really increase that participation so that people don't have to be doing the coding. Even for myself, it would be much faster if I could do it in a form and script the data creation, because the data creation is fiddly.
Thank you so much. Okay, I think we can move on to our last topic today. It's about NARDAC update. Next slide, please. For someone new to this forum, NARDAC stands for North America RDA Committee. Only the cataloging communities that have been implemented RDA can have representation in NARDAC. Next. Next slide. Yeah, for now, those communities are American Library Association, Canadian Committee on Cataloging, and the Library of Congress. The current membership of NARDAC includes 2 representatives from each of those communities. Here are the current representatives. Next slide, please. Our previous NARDAC update forum was held in November 2022. So the following NARDAC updates happened from last November through now. Next. NARDAC invited the PCC RDA Test Committee to give their work updates at last fall update forum. Adam Barron, representing the committee, gave very detailed progress report of the committee work, covering the purpose of the test documentation being used with sample templates, preliminary result of the testing part, and the plan for the coming evaluation and analysis work. If you missed the last November's update forum and are interested in the test, you may go to YouTube for the recorded session. I believe there are close to 20 evaluators for PCC RDA test. 3 NARDAC members are involved in the evaluation work from last November to early February this year. Right now, the test committee is working on data analysis for the final report. Next. Next slide, yeah. Last year, NARDAC members worked on 2 in-person workshops. Based on ALA's request, we turned those workshops into a series of mini webinars so that more audiences can get the chance to know the basics of official RDA Toolkit and how to use RDA Toolkit with other cataloging documentation, including policy statements and the metadata guidance documents. Please note, the webinars will open to core members for free after 6 months. Next. NARDAC also actively reached out to RSC colleagues and representatives from other regions so that our cataloging colleagues in North America can know RDA-related policy work and activities around the world. Again, if you missed the RDA work updates in Europe and Oceania, you can go to YouTube to catch up our last fall update forum. Next. So what's coming next? Next. Yeah. As Adam just mentioned in his presentation, together with the PCC SCT RDA Training Task Group, NARDAC will hold a whole day ALA pre-conference workshop in Chicago. The registration is open right now. In addition to the workshop, NARDAC team will have an update forum at ALA annual. We do hope to see you in person in Chicago. We also plan to have our full update forum in November. Next. Next, I think I maybe kind of, it's already been covered. Next. I think it's the last slide. That's all for the update. And now we are open for the questions. Please let us know if you have any questions related to the NARDAC or any presentation in this forum today. Now we are also open to the suggestions or interesting topics you have for the future NARDAC update forum. Let me check the Q&A part. One comment related to the gender topic, I believe. Another question about what about the representation of North American Library and Information Science programs, specifically those of youth who are cataloging educators. Jamie, can you answer that question? I don't know who should answer that question about the NARDAC representation.
The representation of NARDAC is up to NARDAC. So if NARDAC wants to consider restructuring their composition and who participates right now, I believe they have representation from Library of Congress and from ALA and from CCC, I think it's called, and LAC. So if NARDAC wants to revisit their rules and about representation directly in their group, that's up to them. It would just have to be signed off on by the board, I believe.
Get it. Thank you so much.
Sure.
See any other questions? Thanks a lot, everyone, for being with us. Disconnect. Okay, we hear you, Shanna. I see Kathy also give some information in the chat box. Thanks a lot. We definitely will consider all those suggestions in our
Claire?
Yes, go ahead.
There was a question about when will PCC libraries adopt RDA. I answered this in the chat, but I think I think it would be good for everyone to hear. Just so the PCC task group to test the official RDA toolkit is still working on the analysis of the test. We're hoping that it will be available in June. Afterwards, it will take several months to update the LCPC policy statements and metadata guidance documentation. So at this point, we expect implementation of the official RDA toolkit will be no earlier than early 2024. PCC has not officially updated sort of their timeline, which currently says, I believe, no earlier than June 2023, but we do expect that that will be updated once the report of the test is released. So we also expect that it is possible that it will be a rolling implementation. So not everyone has to implement the first day of implementation. So if PCC says we're starting implementation of the official RDA toolkit, let's say February 1st, 2024, at some random date, that doesn't mean you need to start implementation of the official RDA toolkit that time. You can sort of transition sort of when you're ready during a certain window of time. So we do expect that it will, more information on implementation will be released as it gets closer.
Thank you so much. And also, thanks a lot for raising those suggestions and then questions. We will definitely consider your suggestion in our future meetings. Let me see the Q&A part. Any other? There's a question, when are they pulling the plug on the original toolkit? Jamie, will you answer that question?
Sure, I can answer that question. Hold on, I'll turn on my camera. So that's undetermined. We have several criteria that we are looking at for when we'll pull the plug on the original toolkit. I know that I need to get a Spanish translation done before I can really consider doing that, and that hasn't even started yet. we also need to get to see more people adopting the new official RDA. So those are all things that we're waiting to see movement happening on that. And when we do feel like we're in a spot where we can start phasing out the original toolkit, and we've stated this many times before, we will make an announcement that we are going to phase out the toolkit in a year or so. So what we'll do is we're going to put a countdown clock on the toolkit, and we'll probably announce a month or two ahead of time that we're going to start the countdown clock on a certain date. And then that countdown clock will run for a year. So I can tell you right now, we're probably at least 2 years away from taking down the original toolkit.
Thank you, Jamie. I think we are 3 minutes past our planned time. Thank you very much for everyone being with us. And also I want to thank my team and then also all the presenters. Thank you so much for the great presentation today. We were looking forward to more topics from the audiences in the future. You can contact us with like ALA and Lab of Congress and then CCC. Looking forward to hear from you. Have a nice day. Take good care. Bye.